Throughout history, there have been notable, amazing men who have given us amazing things like Mickey Mouse, Batman, reducing the work week to only 8 hours, 5 days a week. But what if I told you all of these guys were also monsters? Just because a person did something notable and amazing and changed the world in a good way doesn't mean they're not a terrible person deep down. And this is a tough subject because some of these things I'm about to talk about have revolutionized the way the world is, and even things like this video wouldn't be possible without them. However, they had really terrible traits that I think are noteworthy and interesting to talk about. Starting off with none other than Gandhi. This might be the most surprising one on the list unless you know, in which case you know. Mahatma Gandhi was a prominent leader in India. This was at a time where Britain had invaded India and India was part of England, a territory. Gandhi was instrumental in the independence of India from British rule. Gandhi was born on October 2nd, 1869. His philosophy was non-violent resistance, which inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the world. But he was a little bit of a freak. See, he had a dying father, terminally ill, when he was 15, and his wife at the time was 16. And as he was at his dad's bedside, he couldn't help but to leave to go do a little shaboinking with his wife, in which time his father passed and he died alone. Now you'd think that the next part of the story is great. Gandhi decided that he was going to be celibate for the rest of his life. He realized that his need to boink was the reason that his dad died alone, and he felt really, really bad about it. But he took it a little bit too far, in my opinion, and maybe yours. His stance was that all Indians should never marry, and if they do, they should not proceed in boinking with their spouses, which is insane and wild. Apparently nobody taught Gandhi where babies came from. However, the really creepy part, and I mean really creepy, is Gandhi, to test his celibacy, to test his chastity, would lay naked with women half his age. Starting in his late 30s, he would go to bed with sometimes several women, if not one, both completely naked, to test the fact that his mojo wouldn't rise and he wouldn't act on his urges. I don't care what the goal was, laying naked next to a woman who's half your age and you're not married to is kind of weird in order to test your celibacy. The second man on the list is one that you probably didn't expect: Walt Disney. Now, Walt Disney gave us Mickey Mouse, and the only thing colder than his corpse right now was his heart, because it turns out he hated people who didn't look just like him. In meetings and publicly, Mr. Disney would use racial slurs to describe things like the 7 dwarves, using the N-word to describe them, which doesn't even make sense, by the way, because I don't know which film he wrote, but this is the one that I know of, and none of them look like they even fit that disgusting word to be used. Not only that, but he used another word to describe the same ethnicity or skin color to describe children, and this was very open and public. And then in a more secret, private aspect of his life, he liked to use that word a lot. And other ones. He also didn't like Jews either. So if you weren't just like him, he didn't really like you. Nowadays, I would call him a stone cold racist. He's cryogenically frozen, if you guys didn't get the jokes. Third up, Mother Teresa. Yes, so being a terrible person isn't reserved just for men. It turns out that Mother Teresa really didn't do exactly what you think she did in the first place. Mother Teresa is known for helping the sick and the poor and providing healthcare for the most sick and dying in India. It turns out her real motive wasn't to do any good at all, but she had this religion she was pushing, and she wanted to boost the numbers by making herself basically a saint. And it turns out these facilities that she helped to create had next to no doctors, no painkillers, very little food, and they were disgustingly filthy. It turns out, historians think now a lot of people that were in these facilities probably would have been better off without them, and she didn't really stop any starvation or sickness at all. It was all kind of smoke and mirrors. She also had some really interesting quotes, like this one here: "There is something beautiful in seeing the poor accept their lot. to suffer it like Christ's passion. The world gains much from suffering. Yes, something so beautiful about sick and poor people dying horrific deaths. Not only that, but she didn't get treated herself in these places. She would go and find the best medical available, and she would go there for herself. Jumping back to old-timey men, let's talk about John Wayne. Now, if you were born anytime in the last half century, you might not even know who John Wayne is. Or you do, but never watch any of his films. Maybe the most horrific thing he did was portray Genghis Khan. I mean, look at this. This is ridiculous. All kidding aside, he was a racist, and I understand that this was a different time. He was born over 100 years ago, and back then, things were different. Not that that excuses being rude to people, or downright mean to people, or going for people's jobs who don't look like you, but when people say, can you believe that John Wayne said this in 1971, it's really not that unbelievable. In a 1971 interview with Playboy magazine, he made several statements that were widely criticized as racist or white supremacist. He even said, I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to the point of responsibility. The crazy thing is, this was in Playboy magazine, which at the time people actually did read the articles in, so everybody knew about this and nobody really cared. He also didn't feel guilty at all about white people stealing Indians, being Native Americans' land, saying that Indians, in quotations of course, were a little bit selfish in trying to keep the land that they had and prevent white people from coming in and stealing it. Seems weird that he didn't like people stealing land unless they looked like him. He also made some really interesting remarks about how there was too many black people in Hollywood, and Hollywood had its tokenism going a little bit too far. Can you even imagine what he would say now? Going back to the ladies, not to be misogynistic here, we gotta be inclusive, Winnie Mandela, a terrible person. Now, of course, you would think a woman who stayed with her husband through 27 years of incarceration, which he didn't deserve, by the way, would be a saint. What a noble thing to do. Until you realize she was getting shaboinked by a younger security guard the entire time. Now, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and maybe you have different opinions on this. It was 27 years, but I think we can all agree that necklacing somebody who was a traitor, and by necklacing, I mean putting a car tire that was doused in gasoline around somebody's neck and then lighting it on fire just because they didn't agree with her, is probably not something that a humanitarian would do. Winnie Mandela, by the way, was convicted of kidnapping, assault, and fraud. So a very stark contrast to her husband. Next up, Woodrow Wilson, who is the president from 1913 to 1921. Woodrow Wilson actually did a lot of really great stuff. He solidified federal labor laws and codified the 8-hour workday. He didn't really support women's suffrage, but he did allow it. And also, in his book, A History of the American People, he called blacks an ignorant and inferior race. He even said it was a menace to society to let slaves be free without restraint. He then went on to resegregate the federal government and then fire a bunch of people for being black. And then he replaced them with white people. Also, he was a big fan of the Ku Klux Klan. Big fan. The Birth of a Nation was a KKK film that he showed at the White House. Big fan. Also, almost immediately after being sworn in as the President of the United States in 1913, he helped the Federal Reserve Act get passed. If you're unfamiliar with the Federal Reserve and how inflation works, yeah, he kind of doomed us all. And if you're one of those people who can't afford a home, maybe ever, you can thank Woodrow Wilson for starting that up. Just Google the fractional banking system and let me know in the comment section below what you think about it. Bet you didn't know that was a thing. Henry Ford, what a guy. He's the reason that we have an 8-hour workday, 40-hour work week, which you might say, boo this man, or whatever the stupid meme says. But in fact, before that, it was very standard to have everybody working a 10-hour day, 6 days a week. 60 hours at regular pay, no overtime. This was standard. He's also the guy who started the moving assembly line, and he made cars that everyone can afford. He was a serial entrepreneur and did a lot of really great things for the world. And on top of that, he had lots and lots and lots of money, which he used to buy a newspaper to spew his anti-Semitic views. Hold on, I don't mean a little bit, Jews are a little bit gross or whatever people back then used to say. I'm talking about crazy stuff. What he actually said was, Jewish people are the world's largest problem, but he did have some fans, namely Adolf Hitler. Hitler actually had a giant portrait in his office of Henry Ford and said, I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration. Hitler also wrote about him in Mein Kampf, saying Ford is the only man in America not controlled by Jews. Also being the head of Ford Motor Company, he did business with Hitler and the Nazis all the way through World War II. What a guy. And finally, to round it out, one that will divide the audience for sure, Che Guevara. Guevara was an interesting guy, and if you know somebody who wore a shirt with his face on it, why? Most activists of the time promoted peace. He didn't. He liked killing people. A lot. He was an unapologetic psychopath murderer. Some cool quotes by Che Guevara. Blind hate against the enemy creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitations, transforming the soldier in an effect, selective and cold killing machine. People without hate cannot triumph against adversary. He also collaborated with Fidel Castro to create labor camps. So if you didn't like what you were doing, if you were against socialism, let's suppose that you were a capitalist or, I don't know, something terrible like a homosexual, you'd be forced to go to a labor camp. Another really cool quote, if in doubt, kill him. So just don't go to his labor camps if you have like an open mind to other things. There you go, the men in history that are revered as great people but were actual scumbags. Let me know in the comments section below which one you think was the worst, and if you think we should do a part 2, let me know who should be in it in the comment section below. I do videos every weekend, so I'll see you in the next one.